Welcome to Reddit Aliens. Serious. What is the creepiest true story that has happened to you or someone you know? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Around 7 years ago, I was standing in the hallway of my home when I could hear my 3-year-old son chatting to someone in our living room. I went in, and he's facing the back wall and still talking. I ask him who he's talking to, and he replies, bearing in mind he's only a toddler, "The man up in the sky." There was no pictures on the wall, and he was looking upwards at the time. Kinda laughed it off and told the missus we were living in a haunted house. 3 years ago, I arrived home for lunch to find my missus and my youngest boy sitting on top of the stairs. The youngest is squealing, crying, and my missus shouts at me that he said that there's a man in the living room. My oldest boy is now 6 at this stage, and my youngest boy is 3. I go into the living room, and no one is there. Windows are locked, and everything appears normal. I take my youngest boy by the hand and ask him where the man was. He pointed to the same part of the wall that the oldest boy was chatting at. I asked him what the man said. He said, the youngest boy's speech is a little bit better than his brother's was at the same age. The man wanted to take me up to the sky. Right at the same time, there was an overwhelming smell of rotten cigarette smoke that I'll never forget. Freaked me and the missus out. The smell must have lasted for an hour or so. Told her parents, and they convinced us to let a priest bless the house. Had a crazy neighbor lady who was frequently committed to an institution for mental issues. Whenever she was away, her equally, maybe more crazy homeless brother would come to house sit. He had a big white Great Pyrenees dog, and he would tell me that his method of meeting women was to drive into the city when the bars close, and the dog would attract drunken girls so he could talk to them. Oh, and one of his favorite activities was digging holes in his backyard. He claimed he was working on installing some koi ponds. At one point, there was a somewhat infamous murder committed where a local nanny was killed, and the police found only the top torso of the body in a dumpster. News reports claimed that the last person seen was talking to a man with a big white dog after she left a club at closing time. I heard that police investigated the guy next door, but nothing came of it. About 6 months after the murder, the police were next door, and apparently the guy was found all cut up in his bathtub dead. Police came by to talk to me, and I asked, "Suicide?" "No way," said the cop. "Too bloody and violent. Someone did this." But 2 days later, when the news stations caught wind that this guy was a suspect in the nanny killing, it was reported as a suicide. Wife and I are still convinced that the bottom half of the nanny is still buried somewhere in their backyard. A few years ago, I was on a train in Brooklyn, stopped at a station when 4 guys entered the car as the doors were closing. They were carrying several handheld sports bags which they left on the floor. Then they shouted, "Nobody moves, nobody gets hurt." The train started moving. They began to open the bags and setting up some stuff that was in them. One showed a mess of cables coming out, looked like they had a bomb and they were about to activate it. We were maybe 8 people in that train car. We started looking nervously at each other. No one said a word. It was a long way before the next stop. I looked for an exit, no way out. I was trapped. I started sweating. I had the thoughts of, well, this is how it all ends here for me. After what seemed like a long time, but was probably a minute, music started playing, and the 4 guys started doing a performance. We were immediately relieved. To these people, this is not fun gas, and someone could have had a heart attack from this. When I was about 6 or 7, I was in a convenience store with my mother, and this guy came into the store that was really friendly with everyone. Keep in mind, this was the 80s. As he walked in, he made sure to touch as many people as he could. When he first walked into the store, his eyes were normal brown until the sunlight touched his face. His eyes turned yellow with a slit like a cat's. I thought maybe it was just the light, but they did not turn back brown, and he continued to touch people. I suddenly had the urge to scream or vomit. When I saw him reach out to touch my mom, I just started screaming. I remember yelling at my mom to not let him touch her. He paused and then continued to try and touch her anyway. I started hucking those little cans of bean dip at his head to make him back off. That made my mom step out of his reach. I remember sobbing, telling her, "There's something wrong with his eyes. Don't let him touch you." He tried to advance and touch her again, and one of the other customers in the store told him to stop trying to touch her mother. "You're upsetting her child." He stared at me for a moment and disappeared down one of the aisles. As my mom apologized to the store owner, the lady told her she was not upset and that kids and sometimes see things we cannot. She had my older sister, who was 16 and also freaked out by the "take me the car ahead of her." As we were driving out of the parking lot, he started running after our car. My sister and I began yelling at her to keep straight and not turn towards the apartments we lived in. The store was next to where we lived. I'm glad she listened. I just felt like something bad was going to happen to us if he found out where we lived. My mom actually went back to that store a few weeks later and had to drag me in, refused to let go of her hand. The store owner saw how terrified I was of coming in her store and let me know that he was not there today. My mom tried to tell her I had a nightmare. I replied, "How can I have a nightmare when I'm awake?" The store owner told my mom she should listen to me because they brought their granddaughter who was around my age and she reacted the same way to the guy. I went behind the counter and she was curled up into a ball in the corner with tears in her eyes. She said that she could see him too and see his eyes. I asked the store owner why can't they not see him. She told me that she and the other adults were too old. She told my mom that as people get older, they lose the ability to see and that she should listen. After that, we never went back to that store and eventually moved. What do you guys think about this? Do you think that children and animals can see things that we cannot? I do. I've now accurately predicted the deaths of 3 residents in the assisted living facility I work in. I can just kind of feel it, I guess. I start getting this really awful feeling being near their room, and it just gets progressively worse and worse until they pass and the feeling goes away. The worst was room 10. I worked a lot of overnights, and she had hourly checks. One night, after I had a few days off, I go back to work and start my checks, and notice I had my hand on her doorknob and didn't feel anything. When I opened the door, the room was empty. She'd passed on one of my days off, and they forgot to tell me. Well, I might have a story. One year when I was younger, I became suddenly afraid of being hacked or being watched while using the computer. It got to the point where I started having panic attacks if I used a computer alone. I'm not sure what it's called, but it seemed like a temporary extreme paranoia that lasts a few months. It seems to happen like once every year. So, the story is that when I was in a pool at my friend's house, it was very dark around 9:50, and I suddenly started having a semi-panic attack, imagining images of my computer being hacked using spyware downloaded using a rootkit. My mom took me home, and when I booted up the computer to run malware bytes to soothe me, I discovered that a piece of spyware was trying to run its payload. Happened to me. A guy was watching me through my window. I lived on the ground floor for about 4 years, and I didn't notice it up until the end before I moved out. Since I moved into the apartment, I heard noises that were coming from just in front of the window. There were little stones, that's why I heard the noises. Sometimes they were really loud, so I opened the window and looked outside what it was, saw nothing. I thought it would be birds or a little animal. Like I said, these sounds were heard frequently over 4 years. Even friends heard them when they came to my place at the evening or stayed overnight. Turns out, it were at least 2 guys who were watching me and my girlfriend for 4 years. I know because once I opened the terrace door, a guy started sprinting away. I chased him, but he escaped into the darkness. Since then, I knew what was going on, and we saw him and another guy many more times standing at the window watching us. I still have no idea why. They never broke into my apartment. Maybe it was their fetish. Friends that I told were super freaked out because they heard that he knows us now so often when they stayed at my place. Things pretty much escalated from there, resulting in me sleeping with a pepper gun and moving out. It's horrifying to know that some guys watch you eat, F, and sleep for 4 years. Well, I guess I will throw my uncle's stories into the fray after seeing the one about the girl singing. My uncle and his family live in Raleigh, North Carolina, and he told us that the home was built in a burial ground way back when. His son Jacob was born in a fight for his life, barely survived, and was 2 or 3 at the time this took place. They would hear footsteps on the second-story balcony from time to time, toys would turn on randomly, and there were other strange yet unexplainable things that would happen. One night, he was giving Jacob a bath when he starts crying. When my uncle asked him what's wrong, Jacob replied, "It's because the man." When he asked who he was talking about, Jacob replied, the man with red eyes, the crying man." At this point, Jacob pointed to the doorway behind my uncle, and my uncle said he felt pins and needles going down his spine. Felt like he needed to run, but he stayed and got Jacob dried off and has stuck with him for years. I have another story that is quite bizarre from that house if anyone is interested. Here. Cousin and I lived in the same neighborhood within a block or so of each other growing up. We were riding our bikes home late one night from a friend's house who lived at the end of the neighborhood during the summer. It had gotten very dark, and there were no streetlights in our neighborhood yet. We were around 9 or 10 years old. At one point, this truck drove past us. Then a minute or so later, it drove past again. Then one more time. However, the next time, instead of coming back by the opposite direction of us, it came from behind us. And it had shut its lights off and followed us at like 20 to 30 yard distance. I just got a really bad feeling from it. My cousin hadn't noticed until I told him about my gut feeling. Him, being the smart one, suggested I just go into the house instead of continuing to my home by myself. And so we sped up the final 5 minutes or so of the ride. As we got to his place, his dad was at the door angry with us being late. This was in the late 90s, so we didn't have cell phones and we could use the call to help earlier. And as the driver of the truck got to a vantage point where he could see the front door, the driver immediately sped away. I mean, like burnout. My uncle could see the scared look on my face and quickly realized I wasn't scared of him, but I was scared of the truck. He quickly called the police, but only had the dark-colored Ford truck as a description. Don't know whatever happened to that person. The police weren't able to catch anyone with my uncle's description. It is pretty clear, in my opinion, that we were close to being kidnapped. Being a kid, it didn't truly sink in on what could have happened to us, so I wasn't emotionally scarred by it. It wasn't until I was an adult at Thanksgiving one year when my cousin and uncle were retelling the story, and it hit me. Great thinking on your cousin's part to go to his house before you going alone to yours. Could have been much worse. I was about 10 years old, and my mother and I lived in a very small house. I was doing homework one day. The way the room was set up, it had a love seat and couch right across from each other. I threw all the pillows onto the couch and sat down to do homework on the coffee table that was in between the two pieces of furniture. All of a sudden, I was hit in the face by two pillows right in a row. It freaked the shit out of 10-year-old me. Turns out, a woman had died there and was found like 3 weeks after she passed. I have plenty more to tell, but that memory sticks out the most. I remember the details of that night vividly. My cousin was visiting, and my mom was showing her AOL and how to use the internet, the looks of the pillows, etc. I'm pretty sure we lived in a haunted house, or at least a house that attracted ghosts. It was brand new, made by my parents. I was a child, though I don't remember how old, probably 10. And I used to hear at night something or someone kicking loudly the metal door of my room that led to the balcony from outside several times. I would wake up scared from the noise in the middle of the night with my heart pounding and would wait for it to go. I gathered all my strength to see the culprit in action, but there was no one. One day, I decided that it was enough, and one night, right when they started to kick the door, I yelled to them, "Stop! I want to sleep, just leave." And they stopped. They never came back, but there was others. Footsteps in the locked room above mine, the sounds of running up and down the stairs, and my mother saw the shadow of her deceased father in the closed rooftop at night just after she knew that my grandmother had advanced lung cancer. She knew it was him and asked the shadow figure if they had come to take her mother. She pleaded him to take her with him without pain. A week later, my grandmother passed away while sleeping, surrounded by all her sons. It was painless. This happened when I was home from college at Christmas, or maybe early in my career after that. Mom and one of my sisters had been occasionally mentioning, over the prior year or so, that there were odd things happening in the house, like it was haunted, yeah, whatever. Due to it being Christmas and having some relatives staying over, I ended up sleeping on the couch. Around 3 o'clock, I wake up and I hear music, sort of like a music box but more electronic, and it keeps going and going. I get up to investigate and find that two little musical refrigerator magnets are playing and keep repeating. In a remarkable fit of sleepy-brained clarity and just wanting to get back to sleep, I grabbed them both, opened the refrigerator, tossed them inside, and shut the door. Problem solved. The next morning, I've forgotten all about this. At breakfast, Mom is asking why the magnets were in the refrigerator, and it all comes back to me. I relay my experience to her, and her and my sister get all wide-eyed and say, "See, the house is haunted." To this day, I don't know what actually caused those magnets to go into a loop playing over and over. Then there's the late-night weirdness years later when my mother started taking Ambien, but apparently late-night Ambien oddities aren't all that uncommon. I used to work the door at a building that was a funeral home for over a century. Then the funeral home closed and the building was repurposed as a miniature golf course bar. Weird stuff happened all the time. The creepiest was when I would be clearing the place after close. There was somebody giggling in one of the stalls in the women's bathroom on the first floor. When I checked the stall, there was nobody there. This happened several times in the 2 years I worked there. I wasn't the only one who heard it. One night the manager came and asked me if I'd cleared the bathrooms, and I said, yeah, I do my job. The manager said there was someone still in the first floor girls' bathroom. I asked manager if they heard giggling coming from one of the stalls, then explained to the manager about the spook. Then we went and checked the bathroom, and there was, sure enough, nobody there. So a developer was like, be a great place for a miniature golf course and bar? That old abandoned funeral home. Can't stop progress. My bedroom at my dad's place had 2 full walls of windows and a door that led directly to the backyard. I was always weird about securing my curtains to the best of my ability because more often than not, at night, I would get that unsettling sense of being watched. My bed was tucked into the corner of the room, surrounded by the low windows, and even with the curtains drawn, the small openings were still sufficient enough to look through if you tried. Well, I always secured the lock on my door before bed, but it was only the doorknob lock, never the deadbolt. On this particular night, for whatever reason, during my standard nighttime routine, I locked both. I ended up being woken around 3 a.m., and in my barely aware state, I heard the subtle mechanical fiddling sounds of my doorknob. I cleared the fog from my eyes and sat up just in time to see the lock on my doorknob transition from the locked to the unlocked position. Then the doorknob slowly twisted. My heart was pounding, expecting it would open and having no idea what I was about to be faced with. Then I heard the door being pressed, and I heard it catch on the deadbolt, thank God. That's when I screamed for my dad. It took all of about 15 seconds before my dad came barreling in with his .45. I told him someone had tried to come through my door, and he went flying through the outside door. It was dark, and he didn't find anyone. Scared the shit out of me, though. Lots of what-if scenarios run through your head after that. Probably a little late to the party, you're not, but here's mine. I'd actually completely forgotten it ever happened until reading some of the other comments. When I was like 10 or 11, me and my mom were in the living room when we heard a loud knocking come from our kitchen door, which led to the back garden. So we were obviously like, WTF, and went to see what it was. No one there except a little effigy made out of vegetables, potato for a head with a carrot for a body, etc. Can't really remember it in great detail, with a post-it note on it saying, "I'm watching you." Obviously, this had us massively freaked. Grabbed a kitchen knife and started looking through the back garden and checking the sheds in case the person's hiding there. Called the police, and it took them over an hour to arrive, the whole time panicking and thinking we're about to be murdered by some utter nutcase. Turns out, it was just a bunch of kids a little older than me from my neighborhood that I used to hang out with after school. One of them lived in the house which had a back garden that backed onto ours, and they'd all broken through the fence and bushes and placed it there to scare us. Kids are dicks.